YouTube. So, I haven't made a video in a really long time. And I was asked or challenged, I suppose, by Whispering Life to take a stab at making videos again. So here I am. Also, I was inspired by her to actually show my face in a video. So here I am. Anyway, I've been busy. I have a kid, as you probably remember from my older videos, if you watched my older videos. He's 7 years old now, and we've moved 4 times since I last made a video. I just started grad school in last fall. I'm in seminary, and that's been pretty awesome. And so I figured if I was going to make a video, and if the point is to help people fall asleep listening to these videos, listening to me read one of my school papers will definitely do the trick. So I'm gonna read an essay that I had to write for a class on the book of Jeremiah. I'm pretty proud of it, actually. But if you're able to stay awake, you might learn something. But I won't be offended if you fall asleep, since, that's kind of the point. Anyway, I'm going to pull up the paper now, and I'll read it to you. And anyway, thank you again, Whispering Life, for calling me out, I suppose. I do want to thank the few of you who have continued to comment on videos that I've made in the past and ask me how I'm doing and where I am. I am still here, and maybe I'll try to give this a try again. I don't know. I can't promise anything. Life is busy, but we'll see. But for now, here's a video. So here we go. So the title of my paper is God is a Scroll Writer, the Subversive Vision of Jeremiah 31 through 34. Introduction: Jeremiah's images of God. Jeremiah uses a wide range of imagery to describe God, as is to be expected from an Old Testament prophet and poet. These images serve to capture the reader's imagination in order to either break wide the reader's limited perspective of God, frame an understanding of God that makes sense within the reader's worldview, or to ascribe to God characteristics that support the prophet-poet's message. Often these images accomplish all of these outcomes and more. Upon survey, we see that some images used to describe God appear more frequently than others within Jeremiah's text. Like Hosea preceding him, Jeremiah utilizes relational language regarding God, in particular the image of God as a spouse and lover to Israel and Judah. We also see frequent use of the image of God as a farmer and vineyard keeper, of God as a shepherd, a military commander or warrior set to either destroy or deliver, as a variety of wild animals including a lion and an eagle, as well as either natural elements or as the Lord of nature, and a king or political leader and landowner. We can start to see in these broad groups of images that the poet-prophet describes God in ways that reflect major social categories that existed within Judah, namely the categories of family, labor, this essay, I will argue that the writers of Jeremiah, who came from a tradition of subversive scroll writers, self-referentially used the image of God as a scroll writer of the heart to point to a future they are fighting for, a future where the socio-economic systems that failed them in the past are reordered and a new era led directly by the Lord is ushered in. A subversive new relationship, Jeremiah chapter 3. Before we look at the text of Jeremiah chapter 31 verses 31 to 34, we will want to see how the book of Jeremiah develops other images of God in its rhetoric of a subversive new emerging from the painful past. In Jeremiah 3, Jeremiah uses the metaphor of the faithful, faithless spouse to represent God in Israel. This is an incredibly painful, extended metaphor. Anyone in today's world who has ever been in an intimate and committed relationship can relate to the deep hurt and anger that arises from unfaithfulness. This is certainly a pathos that Jeremiah is seeking to tap into in order to drive home to the aloof Judeans the severity of their actions. Yet, as memorable and painful as the image is of a faithless spouse representing Israel, the representation of God in this extended metaphor is perhaps even more remarkable. God is described as the scorned spouse who has every right within the Deuteronomic law to issue a permanent bill of divorce and cut off all relationship with the faithless spouse. Much of Jeremiah 3 seems to suggest that God intends to do precisely that with the northern kingdom of Israel, all while Judah looks on unconcerned, failing to learn the lesson playing out before them. But just when it seems that all has been lost for Israel, God flips the script, starting at verse 12, and offers the possibility of reconciliation between Israel and the Lord in a remarkable bit of contradiction of the very Deuteronomic law that forms the foundation of this metaphor. It appears God is not bound by the metaphor or the law and can choose the path of declaring to Israel, quote, "Return, faithless Israel. I will not look on you in anger, for I am merciful. I will not be angry forever. Return, for I am your master. Read, husband. I will take you, one from a city and two from a family, and I will bring you Zion." In other words, Israel's infidelity cannot extinguish the flame of God's passionate love. God is thus described by Jeremiah using the familiar divorcing couple metaphor only for God to break down that metaphor and do a new thing. This new act of God makes the formerly impossible thing possible. In this instance, the renewal of God's relationship with a faithless and idolatrous nation, Israel. God thus is presented as subverting cultural expectations in the name of the relationship with God's people. Deuteronomic tradition of subversive scroll writing. It should perhaps not be surprising that God is described as a subversive agent in these texts. Jeremiah, the prophet, and the book appear to come out of the Deuteronomic movement. The movement appeared at the end of the 8th century BCE and is so named because of its production of the book of Deuteronomy, a text whose themes we find running throughout many parts of the book of Jeremiah. The movement and text of Deuteronomy promote several key theological concepts, but the core foundational belief is absolute faithfulness to Yahweh over and against any other authority. This stance then puts the Deuteronomic movement at odds with the Davidic kingdom whenever the authority does not align itself with the purposes and will of the Lord. Walter Brueggemann succinctly traces this conflict between the Deuteronomist and the Davidic dynasty in his paper on scroll making in ancient Jerusalem. As Brueggemann notes, scholars see clear comparisons between the form of submission of Israel, Judah, to the Lord with that of vassal kingdoms Assyrian superpower. The book of Deuteronomy lays out the terms of this alliance between the Lord and the nation of Israel, with all of its demands and promises and consequences. Essentially, then, one could view the book of Deuteronomy as an extended metaphor for the relationship between the Lord and Israel. Metaphor is the only means, after all, of explaining what is essentially inexplicable. In this case, the relationship between an invisible God and a nation. According to this metaphor, which is heavily political in nature, the terms of the alliance hinge on the nations following the requirements that the superpower imposes, with the promise of blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. If this metaphor is held on to, and the nation's leaders want to claim special relationship with the Lord, then there are clear limits set on the authority of the rulers of the nation. It would be quite odd indeed for a theology such as this to originate from within a ruling class, and in fact, Bergerman points out that the hypothesis regarding who created the Deuteronomic movement point to the Levites, a priestly group who stood largely outside the elite ruling class in Jerusalem. This observation leads Bergerman to suggest the following. Thus, one can entertain the thought that this is a theopolitical statement on behalf of the rule of the Lord that intends to subvert or delegitimate the power pretensions of the monarchy. If it is correct that the Levites are the progenitors of this literature, then it is most plausible that the affirmation of Yahweh against every other claimant of power is not an altogether disinterested program. That is, insistence upon the direct rule of the Lord implied a de-absolutizing of every other claimant to power. End quote. If we accept as true that the Deuteronomic movement existed largely outside of the powerful elite, then we can begin to see the subversiveness of the material that originated from the movement. According to the tradition, the nation will prosper if the nation's leaders are subservient to the greater power of the Lord. As Deuteronomy 28:1, if you will only obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commandments that I am commanding you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. Conversely, the nation is cursed if it fails to obey, as we see in Deuteronomy 28:15. Quote, "But if you will not obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commandments and decrees, which I am commanding you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you." End quote. This radical alliance with God does not allow the kings and leaders of the nation much of the freedom that kings and leaders often revel in, freedom that often comes at the expense of others in the form of unjust economic policies and political decisions made to benefit only those in power. This limiting nature of the Deuteronomic movement would not have been well received by those in power. After all, who wants to be king if you don't reap the benefits of being on the top of the socio-political mountain? We should now pivot to the question, if this movement was a subversive one, what were the tools they used to subvert power? The short answer is the very thing that survives today, that is, the written word. In other words, scroll writing was the weapon with which the Deuteronomic tradition used to disrupt the unjust elite. The ability to write and share words of commentary, critique, and creative descriptions of the world is a powerful weapon indeed. We have seen throughout history that controlling and censoring the written word becomes a common tool of oppressive regimes, as seen in the popular fiction account found in Fahrenheit 451 of burning books, and the reality of book burnings in Nazi Germany, and even banned books in the United States. Words are power, and allowing subversive words to circulate is a threat to established powers that be. This tradition of scroll writing as a tool of theopolitical subversion can be difficult for us in today's context to immediately understand, because these very scrolls have become canonized as books of the Bible and are often wielded by those currently entrenched in power. For instance, it is remarkable to consider the possibility that the book of Deuteronomy, which is now viewed by many within the Judeo-Christian world as a staid book of laws and traditions that are hard to read and understand, would have originally been seen as politically and theologically revolutionary and progressive. It requires quite a bit of scholarly work and understanding to get to the place where that fact becomes evident. Fortunately for us, we have a fantastic story in Jeremiah 36 that plainly demonstrates for us how dangerous and subversive scroll writing really would have been seen by those in power. A scroll takes on a king. Jeremiah 36. The narrative of Jeremiah 36 opens during the reign of King Jehoiakim, who is the son of Josiah. The prophet Jeremiah is instructed by the Lord to take a scroll and write down all of which God has spoken through the prophet up to that point. Jeremiah employs Baruch to write the scroll and then go read it in the temple, since Jeremiah is banned from entering. Baruch obeys and reads the scroll in the temple, which causes quite a stir with the officials who overhear it. The message of the scroll is apparently scandalous, and Baruch is whisked away and asked to read the message of the scroll to a group of officials. They determine that, quote, "We certainly must report all of these words to the king," end quote. And after learning who authored the scroll, the officials send Baruch away with a warning for him and Jeremiah to hide. This scroll has kicked up a hornet's nest indeed. Baruch leaves the scroll and is taken into the court of the king to be read. It is during this third reading in the presence of the king that the real drama unfolds, as the king's reaction is to take a penknife and cut off columns as they are read and throws them into the fire. Obviously, the king did not much care for the contents of Jeremiah's scroll, and in his eyes took care of it accordingly. He would not stand for being challenged by this scroll and its author. The king finally seeks to destroy Jeremiah and Baruch as well, but is thwarted by God. We then see that God will not be deterred by this petty and impetuous king and commands Jeremiah to write a second scroll and to write all of what was on the first scroll and add to it the judgment of King Jehoiakim as well. While Jehoiakim had hoped to end this threat, the king's action did not terminate the threat of the scroll, but only magnified the problem for the king. This new scroll is thus written, and the fate of the king, and in fact the nation, is sealed. This incredible story does a magnificent job of demonstrating how dangerous this scroll-making endeavor of the Deuteronomic movement, of which Jeremiah is a member, truly is. We also see in this passage how scrolls and their creation seem to have an almost mystical quality. God's powerful word is transported by the scroll into the king's presence, and in a grand reversal, the powerless piece of papyrus defeats the king and his entourage. This is a powerful tool of confrontation, revolution, and potentially of transformation, as Jeremiah notes in chapter 36, 3, quote, "It may be that when the house of Judah hears, they may turn," end quote. The scroll makers of the Deuteronomic tradition recognize this, and they will not stop. Even when one scroll is destroyed, a new one will replace it. God's disruptive word will not be silenced by something so insignificant as a king's childlike temper tantrum. willingness within this community to challenge and contradict established authority does not leave even its own documents and traditions immune from this dynamic movement. We saw an example of this willingness in the earlier discussion of Jeremiah 3 and the description of God as a divorced spouse who metaphorically subverts Deuteronomic law in the attempt of reconciling with wayward Israel. God, and subsequently those within the Deuteronomic tradition, are ever pressing forward while continually remembering where they came from. Thus God reserves the right within the Deuteronomic tradition to do something new while remaining within the tradition of what came before. God, as a scorned spouse, can reunite with faithless Israel in a new relationship. A new and updated scroll can replace the previously cut and burned scroll, and even a new covenant can emerge from a former broken covenant. A new covenant, and God as subversive scroll maker. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 to 34. Jeremiah chapter 31, 31 to 34 makes a truly remarkable promise in the middle of a book that is overwhelmingly focused on God's judgment of Judah and the nations, or, in Jeremiah's words, is describing God's plan to, quote, pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, end quote. Jeremiah 1, verse 10. Here, at the end of the so-called Book of Consolation, God promises to, quote, to make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, end quote. Much of the commentary on this passage has focused on the nature of this new covenant. What is involved? Is it really something brand new, or a renewal of the old Mosaic covenant? Who is the recipient of this new covenant? Jews, to whom this promise is actually given, or to Christians who lay claim to this text both through the words of Jesus in the upper room and most strongly in the direct quotation and interpretation in the book of Hebrews chapter 8, verses 8 through 12. These are difficult questions to sort through, and the commentary is indicative of that. Both Brueggemann and Lemke believe that the text holds a tension of both continuity and discontinuity, of old and new. This makes sense when we consider the nature of the promise. It is connected somehow to the Exodus covenant, quote, when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, end quote. Jeremiah 31, verse 32. But it is also not like that covenant. The text places the coming of the promise into an undefined future. Quote, the days are surely coming, end quote. Jeremiah 31:31. Therefore, this is an eschatological text, and its fulfillment is presented as having a sense of finality. Its promise is fully inclusive. Quote, they shall all know me, end quote. And there is a sense that this new covenant won't be able to be broken, as God is promising to, quote, write it on their hearts, end quote. This isn't simply a code of law that is written down and kept in an ark, or held by the priests and scribes for interpretation and enforcement. It is alive. This new covenant flows through the individual within whom it has been implanted. The recipient of this covenant bleeds the law when cut. It is truly a remarkable promise, and it is a promise that only God can fulfill. The promise of a new covenant makes sense for a people that are primarily collectivist and generally think of themselves in terms of the opinions of others and constantly need others to know who they are. As a nation that was formed from a confederation of tribal identities, it was covenant that held these sometimes fractious groups together. As this unity has fallen apart following the split of the northern and southern kingdom, then the fall of the northern kingdom to Assyria, and now the fall of Judah to the Babylonians, the people that those sent into exile Judean? Are they Israelite? Do they revert back to their family tribal identity, be it Asher or Benjamin or any of the other 12 tribes formerly united under the banner of the Davidic flag? In the midst of this identity confusion, God, through this text, offers the promise of a new kind of covenant. This covenant includes all who come from the house of Israel and the house of Judah, but it is also more individual. This is a promise to individuals within those houses. God will write the promise on their very beings, on their hearts, despite the fact that Judah previously did not return to me with their whole heart. It will be put on their heart, which God sought they remove the foreskin of. Jeremiah 4:4. It will be inscribed on the heart of a people whose hearts were stubborn and rebellious. Jeremiah 5:23. And perhaps most directly connected to this passage, this new covenant will be written on the hearts that have been previously written upon. Quote, the sin of Judah, written with an iron pen, with a diamond point it is engraved on the tablet of their hearts. End quote. Jeremiah 17:1. This promise of a new covenant, written on the hearts of the people, is therefore transformative. It is the act of God who realized that God would have to bring about a fundamental reorientation of the human mind and will. Only then might the covenant promise be fulfilled, that he would be their God and they would be his people. The metaphorical delivery of this new covenant is the primary interest of this paper. This fantastic eschatological new covenant of God and God's people is described as being delivered in the form of writing. We have already seen how the prophet Jeremiah uses a wide range of images to interpret and understand how God functions in society. When it comes time for this text to deliver its most future-looking and hopeful final promise of God, it turns to the image of a scroll writer. God, who wrote the original covenant with a finger on tablets of stone, Exodus 31:18, who authored the words of Jeremiah 1:9, and who commanded Jeremiah to write the scroll in the dramatic action of chapter 36, is promising to seal this ongoing, constantly renewed covenant by authoring it on the fleshy scroll of the hearts of God's people. The results of this action are just as subversive as was the scroll that was delivered to King Jehoiakim in chapter 36. As we see in chapter 31:34, quote, no longer shall they teach one another, or say to each other, quote, know the Lord, end quote, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, end quote. All structures that were previously in place to maintain covenant, be they the temple priestly complex, the monarchy, or even the scribes and teachers from the Deuteronomic tradition, are promised to be made obsolete in some form by this ever-dynamic, always subversive God. The coming promise is a leveling of access to the Lord. Socioeconomic standing, familial connections, and occupational offices will no longer determine who has access to this covenant promise. This leads David Reimer to reveal the implication by way of questions. Quote, if the least as well as the greatest may know the Lord on equal terms, then what kind of culture might ensue? Certainly not one in which education and office gains power and privilege, and where the people know their place, and not one in which the interpretation of God's word is the preserve of a trained elite, where only the learned few are able to speak with authority and say, this is what it means. End quote. Perhaps most stunningly, we see at the end of this promise that by this written edict of the Lord's, quote, I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. End quote. Jeremiah 31:34. The results of this This is a theme we see throughout the entire book of Jeremiah. The Deuteronomic shapers of this text have, quote, taken up Jeremiah's poetry and shaped it into a coherent scroll that stood as a powerful and subversive testimony against the military political policies of Jerusalem, because from a Deuteronomic perspective, those royal policies amounted to deathly options. End quote. It is perhaps appropriate, if not slightly self-referential, that the image of God these subversive scroll writers used to announce this incredible revolution was that of a writer. The members of this Deuteronomic tradition saw themselves as co-agents of this God-led revolution against a power structure that benefited only those who sat at the top. Their primary weapon in this fight was the pen and scroll, and so they also put the pen in the hand of the Lord and the scroll in the hearts of the people. Conclusion. Jeremiah had quite a way with words and images. To the original readers of these texts, the images he used to describe what was happening around them would have had quite an effect. This is particularly true in the ways Jeremiah describes God. These images of God had direct connections to the people who were encountering them, thus making an invisible God visible. Jeremiah also used these images to disturb the people's understanding of the Lord and disrupt the powers that be who claimed authority over the people and consequently claimed authority over the people's access to God. The Lord, however, will not be bound by theopolitical systems and structures. Even the members of the Deuteronomic movement held the tension that their own traditions are subject to God's desire to do something new and be revealed in a new way. In the promise of a new covenant in Jeremiah 31:31-34, God, the scroll writer, invades our very bodies in order to write a subversive new script. This new script will bring to fruition the deep desire of the Lord. All of us, from the least to the greatest, will be able to know God's law and mercy. Words of sin will be erased from the scroll of our hearts and replaced with words of love, mercy, and justice. God is not only a scroll writer after all, but a cosmic scroll editor, correcting the flaws of God's perfect script. Well, I am 34 minutes in. This is by far the longest video I've ever made. Hopefully everyone listening is out cold and snoring soundly. If you made it through the whole video though, and you have any questions that you would like to ask about the paper, by all means ask away in the comment section and I'll do my best to answer any of them. And I suppose that's all. So I will maybe post another video sometime next week if I think of something to post about. If there's any ideas or thoughts on what you'd like to hear me talk about or read or do, I don't know. I mean, just let me know. I'll see what you have to say. So, anyway, thank you for listening.